13.8 billion years ago, the universe and everything that we know and everything that we are and everything that we are made of was created. And everything that exists today are remnants from that first Big Bang. Okay, good. I'm just making sure I have my time, my computer. Liz Jackson warned me, and she was very right. Okay, 380,000 years ago, scientists determined was the first visible light. 50,000 years ago, our brains underwent a major genetic mutation, which resulted in the orientation of the brain that we have today. We have what's called a triune brain, 3 in 1. And that's from the Latin, triune, 3 in 1. I'm much more interested in the structure of the brain as opposed to the sides of the brain, the halves, the left and the right. Scientists have determined that if you do get a brain injury on either the left or the right, that often you can repair that. The brain is much more plastic than we originally thought. So 50,000 years ago, our brains underwent this major genetic mutation. Some scientists call it the Big Brain Bang. Other scientists call it the Great Leap Forward, which I prefer. It's much more poetic, because it was at that time that we leapt into the humans, the species, bless you, that we are today. And this is a rudimentary picture of the brain. So the 3 parts of the brain are the reptilian brain. This part is going to be super fast. My brother saw my presentation a couple of years ago in a different iteration, but when I got to this part, he said the science was a little boring, which was concerning because he's a scientist. So the reptilian part of the brain, that's the part of the brain that controls all of our involuntary action. We actually can't will that part of the brain to do anything. It's about digestion and eye blinking and heartbeat, metabolism, adrenaline. If you were to walk across the street and nearly get hit by a car, you wouldn't be able to say to your adrenaline, okay, kick in. It would happen involuntarily, automatically. The reptilian part of the brain is also the part of the brain that wants to keep us safe and secure at all times. So for those of us that are on the precipice of making a change, or thinking about making a change, or procrastinating about making a change, the reptilian part of the brain is always going to be like, no, don't do it. Never. Don't ever do it. We want you to be safe. We do not want you to be eaten by a tiger. Please don't do anything that has any sort of uncertainty attached to it, because you might die. So what I'm going to tell you from experience is that that voice is actually a voice that is used to keep you safe. But if you want to do something new, chances are you can't be safe necessarily emotionally while you're doing it. And if you're going to wait for that to happen, it's never, ever going to happen. The reptilian brain is the most pervasive part of our brain. On top of that is the mammalian brain. The mammalian brain is the part of the brain that we share with lots of other mammals. Mammals rear their children live. We don't hatch eggs. Reptiles might eat their offspring if they're not quite happy with the way they came out. Humans don't generally do that. But it's also the part of the brain that's responsible for our feelings of love, our feelings of connection, our feelings of wanting to be near each other. We're very social creatures as humans. And then the neocortex. The neocortex is probably the favorite part of the brain of everyone in here. It's all about abstract thinking, language, poetry, art, all the things that we attribute to being creative thinkers. So at that time, we started to behave in ways that are now considered cultural universals. They're cultural universals because it essentially means that everyone all over the planet, no matter their race, their religion, their orientation, their gender, their class, they all behave with these different methodologies. So we have language, art, music, cooking, and self-decoration. This all began about 50,000 years ago when we first started to craft tools out of rock. This helped us become better, more competitive hunters and gatherers. We started to document our reality. This is an image from the caves of Lascaux. We started doing this about 32,000 years ago, 18,000 years after the big brain bang. And I think it's not a coincidence that we've gone from drawing our reality, documenting our reality on the cave walls of Lascaux to now documenting our reality on the walls of Facebook. This is a picture that I took in Petra, Jordan. I did a National Geographic expedition earlier this year where I went to try and understand our origins, the origins of religion, the origins of art, and the origins of the way that we connect. This is Petra, Jordan, which showed really adept use of the stone tools that we were making because we were essentially crafting our own 2- and 3-bedroom apartments out of the rocks. And that scene in Indiana Jones where they go into the cave and look for the Holy Grail, that actually exists. That really exists. It's called the Treasury House in Petra, Jordan. 10,000 years ago, our worlds really created the reality that we now have in so many ways that it's almost extraordinary. About 10,000 years ago, we started to array ourselves with makeup. Now, while that might not seem all that revolutionary, all that significant, what we were doing was not for beautification purposes in trying to seduce each other. We started to array makeup 10,000 years ago in order to be more beautiful to God, to a higher power. We felt so deeply about this higher power and considered this higher power so important that we wanted to dress up in the same way that we might when going to synagogue or church now. What's interesting about this is that at that very same time that we started to have this consciousness of this higher power, we also began to realize that different people had different beliefs about what that higher power was. And that's when our first religions were created. We created, us, the human species, created our first symbols, our first telegraphic symbols that signified meaning. We created that meaning, we created the belief of this meaning, and then we manufactured meaning around the symbol that we then created consensus around. So it's quite an extraordinary thing. We had a belief. We wanted to signify to others that we had that belief telegraphically. So we created a symbol embedded with a message, embedded with an idea or a belief. And then we created consensus around that belief and what that meaning stood for. We created our first tribes through the use of a visual language that was all about articulating our religion. That mutual agreement fostered a sense of pride and connection in the sense that I knew, that you knew, that I knew, that you knew, that we were safe because we all believed the same things. The more people believed, the stronger the tribe. The stronger the tribe, the more secure you felt. That's when I believe we created our very first brands. I define brands as manufactured meaning. That doesn't mean necessarily that the meaning isn't true. It just means that we are embedding an idea into a symbol that we then collectively agree means something. So Caroline Jones developed the Nike swoosh. That Nike swoosh was socialized and popularized. There was consensus around what that meant. And now, non-verbally, we can look at it and we all know, just do it. But we didn't always agree back then, we still don't today, that what that symbol meant was actually the truth. There was no empirical evidence that said, this is the truth. And so we had people that had different symbols start to fight about what those symbols stood for and whether or not they were accurate. Sound familiar? We're still doing that today, 10,000 years later. So we went to war. We started our first wars were religious wars. We believe this, you believe that, and we're going to fight. Now, the interesting thing is this is when flags were first developed. Flags were first used on the battlefield to signify which side of the battlefield you belonged to, because there was no way by just looking at another person that you could determine whether they were a friend or a foe. So you needed some type of designation. There were no mass-marketed uniforms. There weren't T-shirts emblazoned with a logo. So there was one big flag that meant that you either belong on this side or that side, and that's the side you went on, and you fought the other side. Then we started to develop crests and shields to signify lineage, especially if we won the war. Fast forward 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago, we come upon, for the first time ever in our history, the word brand. Now, the word itself is actually brand, and it was used in the Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf, and it literally means to destroy or to mark by fire. To destroy or to mark by fire. And that marking by fire became the way that cattle ranchers associated their identity with their cattle. First, they used pine tar to paint on the animals, and then for speed and efficiency, they used hot iron brands. And that hot iron brand became a symbol of identity. 143 years ago, brands became legally recognized. They became legally recognized in that there were rights and laws and rules that were associated with owning a brand, with operating a brand, and suddenly the relationship between brands and people changed. 10,000 years ago, we, the people, created our first brands for each other and by each other. They were created for people, by people, and they essentially signified belief. Monetizing those beliefs came much later with the advent of the Catholic Church. But initially, they were very bottom up. We were creating a brand, a mark, a symbol to signify our belief. That belief at the time was about something higher than we were, and it was very bottom up. 143 years ago, that equation flipped. And suddenly, with the legal recognition that brands had and the profit that one could gain by owning and operating one, the corporation started to appropriate the ways in which brands were being operated and distributed and supplied and made and marketed and promoted and so forth. And the relationship flipped from bottom up to top down. The very first trademarked brand in the United States was Bass Ale. And I kind of love what this says about our humanity, because the first trademarked brand in the United States was not an American brand, and it was an alcoholic beverage. That's it. That's all we have to tell, like, the people that come from outer space about who we as Americans are. And this is the way we shopped. This is the way we shopped. We went into a market. The market was usually co-located in somebody's home. The idea of going away, getting out of your house, going somewhere, working, leaving work, going home, and then being home was almost like as absurd as thinking about Blockbuster and the way we used to get movies. So we'd go into a general store, we'd ask for how much we wanted, it was put into a bag or a canister, it was weighed, we paid usually by the weight, and then we went back to our homes. Now, in that 143 years, we're looking at a world that now kind of looks like this. The average supermarket has over 38,000 brands. There are over 100 brands of nationally advertised water, over 113 different types of contact lens solution, and every year it seems that there are at least 5 new Oreo flavors or configurations that come out. And this isn't really about whether this talk isn't really about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, although it might seem like that when looking at one of the 45,000 malls that are in the United States that all look exactly the same. I'd give almost any amount of money if anybody could identify which mall that was. They all have the same stores. But is it a good thing or a bad thing? We're humans. We're all doing this together. People talk about bad corporations or evil corporations. The corporation isn't a living, breathing thing. The corporation is populated by people, and those people have morals or not, and those behaviors become the cultural currency that we're dealing with. When you look at the various companies that are vehemently against branding, so for example, the no logo contingent or the ad busters, what I found was when I did my research and continue to do my research is that all of these organizations are using the very tenets of branding that they are so vocally and disdainfully against. They all have logos, they all have websites, they all have social media feeds. For a while, if you went on the Adbusters website, you could find Adbusters branded sneakers that they were making in order to raise money. So for me, this isn't really about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm endlessly fascinated by the capacity we have for symbolic language and how we imbue that language with meaning and then agree on what that meaning is. So I decided when I first got a question from a goddaughter that I have about why MySpace was so popular. Anybody remember MySpace? She asked me in 2005 why MySpace was so popular, because she thought I was a brand expert. And I didn't know why MySpace was so popular. MySpace had started about a year before and had quickly become the #1 website on the internet. It had surpassed Google in the number of page views it was getting per day, and I, the supposed brand expert, had no idea why it was so popular. I went, I registered, I thought the interface was ugly, I couldn't really understand the navigation, and never ever went back. But I was really embarrassed and ashamed that I didn't know why the #1 brand on the planet was as popular as it was. And so I decided to do quite a bit of research that I'm still doing. And you might think, well, Deb, you know, MySpace isn't that popular anymore. Maybe this is irrelevant now. You should start on something new. But our behavior is exactly the same. Our behavior really hasn't changed in over 10,000 years. And so I'm endlessly, endlessly interested in why we continue to make things, why we continue to buy things, why we continue to brand things, and why we continue to fight over what those brands and those beliefs mean. So what I did was, from the advent of the Trademarks Registration Act, I created a timeline that allowed me to look at all of the brands, all of the really significant brands that have come out in the last 150 or so years, with an understanding of trying to organize them into movements or to categories, and what I ultimately termed waves, 5 waves of modern brand evolution. And what I found was that each wave essentially ushered in a new class of brands. So did we create our brands, or did our brands create us? I'm not entirely sure. So I'm going to take you through the waves, and then ultimately I will answer the question, why did MySpace become so popular? But I'm also, I think, going to answer a question that you're probably thinking about quite a lot, which is, am I addicted to my device? How many people here think that they're addicted to their devices? Okay, that's a lot of hands. How many people sleep next to their device with the device on? Okay, you're all addicted, everybody. That everybody's addicted, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I think you are, and it's, I think, going to surprise you. So wave 1, from right after the advent of the Trademarks Registration Act until about 1920 or so, brands were the paramount attribute of quality and consistency. You expected that if you had a Coca-Cola in Bend, Oregon, and then took a train to New York City, that those Coca-Colas would taste exactly the same. These packaged goods signified premium, and consumers were really, really willing to pay a premium for something that was in a box, in a bag, in a canister. These are some of the brands that were very popular at the time, and what I can tell you is that if you don't think that safety was a really unique selling point, I'm not supposed to go past the pink line, but I do want to point out, oh, is there a laser? No, no laser. You can see that word safe there. And while that might not seem like that big a deal, there were no plastic bags back then. There was, the only kind of hygiene we had was hygiene that we took care of on our own. There was no sanitation. If we had babies, their diapers were not disposable. We had to dispose of the excrement ourselves, which, as you can well imagine, created some really, really challenging hygiene experiences. So the idea that something was safe was of really paramount importance to people. What's interesting was that at the time, consumers were willing to pay a premium for something that was in a box, in a bag, in a canister, that was wrapped. Now, we're actually willing to pay a premium for things that aren't in those boxes, bags, and canisters. Wave 2, brands become anthropomorphized. Now, this is the gold rush of modern branding. This is sort of like the 1990s internet boom. Everybody wants in on the action. And we didn't see a lot of innovation at this point, but we did see a lot of growth. And because people saw that folks like Procter and Gamble and the Kellogg's brothers and the Johnson family were all making a lot of money creating brands, they decided they wanted in on the action, and they started to create copycat brands. And because there was no unique selling point to most of these brands, they were trying to create difference and attention with characters. And so these were when our first brand mascots were developed. None of these were real. Sometimes companies pretended that they were real. People were so convinced that Betty Crocker was real, and all they could ever see were pictures of her and her voice on the radio. There was no television yet. That one man actually called up Betty Crocker, the company, General Mills, and asked for her hand in marriage. So I sort of see that as the first brand stalking. Uncle Ben, complete fiction of the imagination. Same with Aunt Jemima. These characters were all created to imbue a sense of relationship into the brand. This is when the first consumer brand relationships were constructed. Anybody know these guys? So this is one of the original illustrations of Snap, Crackle, and Pop, the mascots of Rice Krispies. So I'm going to take you down two little sidebars of obsession that has occurred while I've been doing this research, and the first is with children's cereal packaging. Children's cereal packaging is really surreal. I don't know if you spent a lot of time in the children's cereal aisle, but this is what Snap, Crackle, and Pop look like now. Really hallucinogenic in a lot of ways. And I became sort of obsessed. Why are cereal packages so ugly? Why are they so intensely colored? And here's 3 examples. Now, there might seem to be a lot of common denominators just right off the top. The color, the garish type, the way in which the architecture is laid out. But there's also something else that's similar about these packages. It's the eyes of the characters. They're all looking down. That really got in my craw. I didn't know why, and I needed to find out why. Then I did some research on this brand. Milk-Bone, dog biscuits. We took a whole series of front face panels into research to show to consumers to ask which dog pose they felt most excited about. And what we found with real statistical significance is that people liked when dogs were looking directly out into the ether, when they were looking directly eye to eye, face to face with the consumer. And we heard things like, I feel like the dog just gets me. I feel like my dog is peering into my soul. And it hit me. The reason why these little guys are looking down is because our little guys, when we take them to the supermarket, are looking up. And that was creating the same type of relationship that our dogs looking directly at us was taking. So just a little behind-the-scenes info. And I'm going to show you one other example. I get into these like obsessive states with brands. I can't help myself. Wave 3, brands become self-expressive statements. So that means that by the sheer virtue of wearing something and communicating that telegraphically to you, I'm telling you something about myself. So for example, when I was in the 7th grade, all the cool kids were wearing Levi's. I was not wearing Levi's. My mother was a seamstress. We were not particularly well off. She couldn't understand as a seamstress what we were paying extra money for with a little red tag on the back pocket, and she offered to sew a little red tag on the back of my existing dungarees, as they were called back then, not realizing that that would actually be worse than not having a pair of Levi's. She finally relented and broke down and bought me a pair of lime green corduroy bell bottoms. I assume she picked them up in the triple markdown bin, but I didn't care. Suddenly, I had what was necessary to be considered as an entrant into the cool kids. Now, I didn't become cool overnight. The idea that I could be cool was what kept me going. It didn't work, but that's a whole other talk. So for the first time ever, brands could provide status. And this is really where it gets psychologically interesting, because branding turned into belonging. By the sheer virtue of my wearing a pair of pants, I could conceivably belong to the Levi's tribe. So belonging to a tribe, to a religion, to a family, branding demonstrated that sense of belonging for both the people who were part of the same group and also for the people that were excluded. Because you were then told by the sheer virtue of being excluded that you weren't part of this movement, this tribe, this family, this organization. And so brands that were popular at that time, Levi's, a whole political statement by driving a certain kind of car, and then, of course, Nike. Now, the original sneakers were actually used in sanitariums to keep mental patients safe. Just interesting in how that turned into an athletic shoe. Now, my other sidebar. Anybody know who this is? This is the Marlboro Man. The Marlboro Man, it's interesting because the Marlboro Man has not been advertised in this country in over 20 years. And yet I have students that are 16, 17, 18, 19. They all know instantly that this is the Marlboro Man. That's how deeply embedded this iconography is in our culture. But Marlboro didn't always start out as Marlboro. This is another one of those stories where I'm like, how did this happen? How is this something that's so pervasive in our culture that people that weren't even alive when the brand last advertised know who this is? Well, believe it or not, Marlboro started in the mid-1800s, also in the UK, and it was originally launched as a cigarette for females, kind of like Tab was back in the day as a soft drink, specifically for women. Now, the reason it was launched is because I don't know if anybody has ever seen what happens if you do smoke a non-filtered cigarette, but because the paper is so thin, you often will get, sort of like if you're smoking a joint, you might get some paper residue on your lips. Well, at the time, in the mid-1800s, this was considered blasphemy. A woman having some sort of residue on her lips. And lest you think I'm joking or exaggerating, let's just look up at that headline, "Ivory tips protect the lips." So you don't have to worry ever about looking messy. You could even ski and smoke safely. The cigarette did not do well, and like all products that suffer that fate, it is taken off the market. And so when we're thinking about why do we have certain brands, aren't they really bad for us? Aren't they really bad for the environment? Aren't they really just bad, bad, bad? I want you to think that someone out there wants them, because companies and corporations don't keep products on the market for altruistic purposes. They don't keep brands on shelves because they're really happy with the brand and hate for them to see it go. They do it because people are buying it. I often joke that someone out there must love peach-flavored diet powdered iced tea because it's being sold. And I can also tell you that in all the research I've done with paper products, people might think that they want to recycle and be avid recyclers with their water bottles and so forth, but people really like white, soft toilet paper. And don't think that they're making a difference if they buy it, when in fact that's all they're doing is making a difference if they buy it. So it's important for us to realize that individually we are making a difference if all the individuals do something at once, and that's how a movement begins. So in any case, back to Marlboro. Marlboro decided back in the 1950s, so 100 years after the brand was first launched and failed, when they started to get wind of the possibility that cigarette smoking might not actually be that good for us, that they maybe should bring back this patented tip that they'd created to try to keep some of the toxins and carcinogens from getting into the body. And so they brought back this filtered tip cigarette, but were so worried that there would be any memory of it being associated as a female brand that they used really hunky dudes in all of the advertising. You see, women will buy products that are targeted to men. Women will buy Gillette razors. If they need them, they might also buy Venus. But men will never buy brands that are specifically targeted to women. They will never buy a Venus. It's all the same blade. I can tell you I worked on both. So they started bringing out these hunky guys, and the one hunky guy that really resonated in our culture was the cowboy. And that became the mascot of the brand until the brand stopped advertising 20 years ago. So that's the backstory on Marlboro. So wave 4, brands become an experience. They become something that just by the sheer virtue of engaging with the brand, you're expected to have some sort of an emotional transformation. And these are some of the popular brands. Disney, Apple does more than social devices. They design experiences that get you, learning experiential marketing from Starbucks. So before we get to wave 5, I just want to talk very briefly about our cultural universals and sort of bring that all around. Just a reminder, language, art, music, cooking, and self-decoration. These universals essentially allow us to connect with each other. But we're not alone in this instinct to connect. And if you look around the planet, you see this in many, many, many species. You see it in fish, you see it in ants, you see it in birds, dogs, requisite cute dog picture, cats, monkeys, and then people, and people in cultural movements. So all hippies pretty much looked alike. All Hells Angels look alike. Preppies, same uniform. Goth. Isn't it interesting that we need to use these symbols to signify who we are telegraphically to others? So the ultimate human connection, and one that we're all part of, is the family. And the family is so deeply ingrained in our instincts that in the 1950s, when Harry Harlow and John Bowlby did studies to determine what and how deep that instinct went, they found that given the choice between food and comfort, first, baby monkeys and then baby humans always chose comfort. They would much rather choose a connection to their caretaker and be held in the arms of their caretaker, skin on skin, than eat. So they'd rather die of starvation than die of isolation. And what we found is that the worst possible human punishment we could inflict on someone is actually not torture. It's actually solitary confinement. Humans will have a psychological break with reality first, before physical torture with solitary confinement. We cannot bear to be alone. There was an article in the New Yorker a couple of years ago that talked about how dreadfully we have that break with reality and will often resort to eating ourselves to try and disappear. So, humans are happiest not when we buy a big flat screen TV or a new pair of shoes. We are happiest when our brains are harmoniously resonating with others, when we feel that we are understood, when we feel connected. Humans are happiest when our brains harmoniously resonate with others. But we are living in a day and age where that is being challenged. The ability to do that is being challenged. From a population standpoint, more and more Americans first, and now this is being replicated all over the world, are choosing to live alone. Single household families. So that means just one person. Now, the time frame in which this has happened is astronomical. So if we go back to 1950, the average single person living alone was 1 in 10. Now it's less than 1 in 3. But what's even more interesting is what happens intellectually and culturally. In the 1950s, that single person living alone was a misfit, was a spinster, was an outcast. Now, That's a rite of passage, and it's celebrated, and lots of television shows are made around the notion of what that experience is like as a single person living alone. So where does that leave us? The path to wave 5. How did we connect? How were we connecting over these years, over these waves? First, we were sitting, listening in wave 1, listening to the radio, falling in love with Betty Crocker ads. Then we moved to the black and white television. It took 35 years for 150 million consumers to own a television set. There were 5 channels. There were no remotes. In the 1960s and 70s, I was my father's remote. He would yell for me to come and change the channel because he didn't want to get up, and he'd have 5 channels to choose from. Wave 3, color television, still hanging out in the living room. Wave 4, you probably recognize some of these stances, playing video games. And now, wave 5. Anybody not know what he's doing? Sort of like the Marlboro Man, right? You just know. So if we looked at this from an evolutionary perspective, it has to be updated, but it's still pretty close. So let's look back at the beginning of this new wave that we're in, right before this new wave. So the years right before 2005 when I suggest that wave 5 began. We forget what was happening in the world. In 2001, 6 weeks after 9/11, this little device was launched, the iPod. And this also took social cachet to a whole new level. It was the notion of, I know that you know that I know that you know that we're cool early adopters because we have these white earbuds. Really distinctive. It became so ubiquitous, though, that you ended up seeing things like this, and they weren't jokes. But what was happening between 2001 and 2004? How were cultural anthropologists and behavioral sociologists thinking about this device? What were they seeing? What were they noticing? Well, what were we doing? We had AOL. We weren't doing quite as much as we're doing now. We had AOL. We had Amazon. Amazon had 1.5 million books. And this is what it looked like. We played games. And there was porn. Porn was the #1 commercial enterprise on the internet. So what were the cultural anthropologists and the sociologists writing? They were calling this particular moment in time from 2001 to 2004 a time when civilization was doomed because we were all suffering from cultural isolation. And this was the big headline everywhere. So you could see iPod era of personal media choices may be turning us into an isolation nation, and so on. This was the common headline. And then in the New York Times, at the end of 2004, I'll read this, James Katz, a communications professor at Rutgers University, attributed the iPod's popularity to a trend in the American culture toward withdrawing from the public sphere or the public culture into one's private space where you can have complete control over your entertainment. The iPod psychologically depopulates social space for you. It increases isolation and anomie. 2004, December of 2004, what launches in 2005? Something pretty remarkable happens. Our brains invent a way to connect in the device. It was causing us isolation. We can't live with isolation. We create a way to connect through the device. And MySpace is created and quickly surpasses Google as the #1 website on the planet. They didn't hold that title for very long. We see all of these things now, and I call Wave 5 brands limbic brands or brands as connectors. It's not just online. We're connecting everywhere we can because we're not connecting as much at home. Whether we're sharing our cars, our homes, or our office spaces, this is pervasive. Now, what I am going to tell you is that I don't think that we're addicted to our devices. I don't think it's the device that we're addicted to. That would be like saying that drug addicts are addicted to the syringes. That's not what it is. We're not addicted to the device. We're addicted to the feelings that we get through the device. The feelings of connection, the dopamine, the sense of being maybe better than who we are, the sense of reassurance, the sense of being liked, the sense of having friends. These connections have upended branding as we know it. And while it is really, really concerning how much time we are spending in our devices, because that's where we are, we're in them, the good news is that the discipline of branding has changed more in the last 2 to 3 years than it ever has before because of our ability to connect. So for the last 10,000 years, since those early images that I showed you of the religious symbols that people made for people to associate with beliefs and movements, that whole way of communicating was appropriated by the corporation. And the corporation took that over. And we were, in many ways, subservient to it. Corporations owned brands, distributed brands, marketed, promoted, and collected the profits to distribute among their shareholders. But, branding has now become democratized via our ability to connect with each other. Brands, once again, not that we ever couldn't do it, but I don't know that we necessarily realized we could do it. Brands can be created by anyone and shared by everyone. So again, we have the ability to create brands, to create movements, to create beliefs and ideas that can connect with others by the people, for the people. And I believe that the most significant brands being made today are the brands that are doing just that. It's brands like this. I think the most compelling brands now are not about providing a different form or a different flavor. Big whoop, it's in a different can. The best and biggest and most important brands now are the brands that are making a difference in people's lives. So now we're up to 2016. 2016, a brand came into the market really quickly. About 6 weeks after the election, a brand launched into the market that had all the attributes of a great brand. The two greatest attributes that brands can provide from a visual point of view are shape and color. That's why Coca-Cola is as popular as it is. Shape and color, then numbers, then maybe if you can read words. So in 2016, a brand was launched about 6 weeks after the election. It was created by two women on the West Coast. And by January 21st, 2017, 150 million consumers were engaged with that brand. So it took 35 years for 150 million consumers to own a black and white television set. It took 7 years for consumers, 150 million consumers to own a cell phone. It took 3 months for 150 million people all over the world to don a pink pussy hat because it was signifying a belief that they had that they felt mattered. So I believe that branding is now, can be, and should be a profound manifestation of the human spirit. Because if we create the brands that we want to see in the world, we can remake the world in the way that we want it to behave and the way that we want people to behave with each other and for each other and to each other. So Malcolm Gladwell says it best always. Never before have we had these kinds of communications technologies in the hands of those who have the greatest desire to innovate and change and create. And that's us. That's you. So we can make a difference by the brands that we make, the things that we create, and the way that we behave. Thank you so much for having me here.